Well, it's great to have everybody here today, man. We're glad that you're worshiping with us. If you're joining us online, we're so thankful to have you with us online today. We love that you're able to do that. You can follow along this morning if you're using YouVersion on a smartphone or a tablet or some type of device. If you have the YouVersion app, you can follow along with the message there. We also have an outline on the back of the bulletin. You'll be able to follow along there, or we'll have everything up on the screens for you as well. If you're new today, or maybe you haven't been to church in a really long time, I'm just really happy that you're here today. I'm excited for you. I don't believe you're here by accident, but I believe God ordains things. And I hope you feel welcomed, and we'd love the opportunity just to connect with you after the service. If you'd let us do that, we'll be out in the foyer, just to the left of the doors there at the guest connection desk. We'd love to just shake your hand, say hello, answer any questions you might have, if you'd give us that opportunity. At the end of the service, my wife will come and she'll give us some direction on next steps, and she'll kind of fill that in for us later on. So be looking out for that. But listen, when I was in high school, I had an English teacher who was big on having us write papers. My junior and senior year, I never wrote so many papers in my life because this particular English teacher wanted us to do that. And these papers that we had to write would always begin with a rough draft. Then we would have a second draft, and then we would have to write a third and final draft. And during all the drafts that we had to create, the teacher would always require us to stay inside the red lines on the sides of the paper that we used. Do you know what I'm talking about? Those little red lines that run down the side of either page. And the reason the red lines were there, we call those red lines what? Margins, right? And the reason we call them margins and the reason they're there is to create space on either side of the page to help us to keep organization in our writing. And more importantly, my teacher was so insistent that we not write inside the margins, that we not write outside the margins, that we stay inside of the margins, because what she would do is as we would work on our drafts and turn the organization to our paper, but also to leave room on the sides for her to make notes and corrections. Listen, if we filled the margins of our paper with writing, there would be no room left for her to do her work. And listen, we're going to start a new series today called Margins. And for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about this. Because much like the papers that we wrote in high school, many of us know that we need to leave some room and margin on the sides of our lives. We need to leave some space in our life for the teacher to bring correction and to bring instruction and to bring clarification to our lives. But we rarely leave the space for those things to happen, don't we? We live our lives in a way where they would easily be derailed because we don't have the margin necessary to live the way that God wants us to live. And we need margin in our lives so that we can live healthy, and most importantly, so that we can be in a growing relationship with God. And so as we dive into this new series today called Margins, and over the next few weeks we're going to be taking a look at what it means to create the space necessary in our lives. Because listen, there's one thing I've learned in my short 42 years, almost 43 years on this earth, and that is this: everybody's given the same 24 hours. Nobody gets more and nobody gets less. Everybody gets the same amount. It's what we do with it that makes the difference. And so many of us are in a place where we're living to the edges of the page. If we had a financial crisis, we don't have the margin to make our way through the financial crisis. If we had a spiritual crisis, we don't have the margin in our spiritual lives where we could hear God speak to us. If we had a crisis in our physical lives, we don't have the margin. We're living at the very edges of our lives, and then we're wondering why things get hectic and crazy and start to crumble. And so I believe as we talk about this topic of margin in our lives, we're going to see why it matters, why it's necessary. And we're going to see that it's actually the way that we create the space necessary for God to work in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. Because when we create the space, when we create the margin, we leave room for God to fill it in. We leave room for God to show us how to live and teach us how to be and show us the way that we're supposed to go. In fact, and I want to share this because in fact, the Apostle Paul tells us that creating margin and being intentional about what we do with our lives and with our time is actually a spiritual practice. This isn't just something, we talked about it last week too, where we say, people say, oh, this is just pop psychology. You're just trying to tell us how to live better. No, this is a spiritual discipline. This is a spiritual practice. What we do with our lives and what we do with our time is a matter of spirituality, not a matter of psychology. The reason the psychology of it works is because the principle is true in the Scripture. And so as we look at this, we're going to see that what we do with our lives and what we do with our time is a spiritual practice that has a lasting impact on how we can know and do the will of God. So I want to say this. For those of you who've been wanting to know, what is God's will for my life? You've been asking that question. What does God want me to do with the rest of my life? The way you start to answer that question starts with creating margin in your life so that God can speak to you. This is where it all begins. If we don't have the right time frame, if we don't have the right margins in our lives, we're going to miss out on what God says. And this is a spiritual thing, and I want to show you why. In the book of Ephesians, this is going to kind of be our passage for the entire series. We're going to use this as our launching pad. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. Here's what it says. Pay careful attention then to how you live, not as unwise people, but as what? As wise people. So you see, live the opposite of unwise, live wise. And so Paul says in verse 16, making the most of the time because the days are evil. So don't be foolish. Here's verse 17. So don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do you see how time and margin equates to God's will? If we have the time and the margin in our lives for God to speak to us, we're going to begin to understand what His will is. And so Paul shows us that we ought to be paying attention. Here's what he says. Paying attention to how we live our lives, not as unwise, which is living to the very edges and fringes, not as unwise, but as wise people, creating margin in our lives. And this is being intentional and taking inventory of where we are. And here's what we have to do. We have to be honest about the state we find our lives in right now if we want them to change and be different. Right? Because here's the thing. How can you get where you want to go if you don't know where you are to begin? So you've got to be honest about where you are right now. If we would all be honest and take an inventory of our lives, we would see that most of us, probably all of us, are living somehow in the margins. Maybe we're living all the way to the edge. Maybe it's just across the little red lines. Maybe we're pushing the envelope in some areas, but we're doing okay in others. But in order for us to change and grow, we've got to understand where we are currently. And we're being called to live as wise, not unwise. And as wise people, we begin to create margin, making the most of the time. Like Paul says, making the most of the time in the moments that we've been given. And so as we begin to create the necessary margin in our lives, we will begin to understand what God's will is. So let me tell you what creating margin is this morning. Creating margin is the intentional act of paying attention to how we live, making the most of the time, and allowing God the opportunity to speak into our lives and to share His plan for us. That's why it matters that we live inside the margins, so that God has the time He needs to work in our hearts. So let's ask and answer this question this morning as we move into this. What is margin? Let's talk about that for a minute. What is margin? Well, here's a definition that we're going to use as we work through this over the next few weeks. What is margin? Margin is the amount available beyond what is necessary. That's what margin is. It's the amount available beyond what is necessary. Margin on the piece of paper, as well as in our lives, is the amount that we have left after we have used what is necessary. And we make decisions about margin in our lives all the time, right? If you work a full-time job, maybe you work 35 to 40 hours a week, that time is spoken for, right? You don't necessarily, unless you're self-employed, you don't get to decide what to do with that time. That time is decided for you by your employer. So that's inside the margin. You live that time inside the margin. What's outside of the margin is the time outside of that 40 hours a week. Is the time outside that's already been decided for you. And so as we see what a margin is the amount available beyond what is necessary. Maybe we can take a look at it this way. This morning as you came in, you should have received a bulletin. And inside that bulletin, there's just a blank piece of notebook paper. Right? Maybe you opened up your bulletin this morning, you're like, they forgot to put the information on the insert. No, we didn't forget. That's intentional. The page is blank for a reason. Hold on to that because we're going to use it at the end of service. But if you look at that piece of paper, you'll see that there's red lines on either side. Whether you're looking at the front or you're looking at the back, you can see the margins that run about an inch on the inside of the page. And the space between the margins, those white lines, that white space in between, is what was necessary for me to write my English paper. That was the space I had to use. Everything on the outside of those red lines was for the teacher. And listen, if you use the space between the margins wisely, you don't need the space in the margin. If I will pay attention, and I never got it right, but if I would have paid attention in English class, the margin wouldn't have mattered. I didn't need the margin because I wrote the paper inside the lines. The problem is I always tried to squeeze more in the lines than I probably should have. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Because it's the same with our lives. If we use the time, the money, the relationships wisely, we will be able to have margins that are open for God to move in and open for God to speak to us through. There'll be margin for us to serve others, margin for us to be generous with our resources, margin for us to spend time with and invest in the lives of the people that God has brought into our lives. Margins, listen, margins don't hinder us. Margins actually serve to free us up. See, I used to look at the margin when my English teacher would say, don't write outside that red line. I used to look at it as a rule to not do. And she was just trying to hem us in, and I can get it all on the front of this sheet. But she wasn't trying to hem us in. What she was trying to do was leave room for her to make our paper better. Leave room for her to speak into what we were writing. And if I would have ever gotten it, I was a terrible student. You need to know that. I was a terrible student. I graduated high school with a 2.6. Some of you in this room graduated summa cum laude. I graduated thank the Lord. Okay? Some of you in here, you look at a book and all the words jump into your head. It takes me, listen, I did the dumbest thing I could have ever done. 6 weeks ago, I picked up a biography on Frederick Douglass that is 765 pages long. I've been reading it for 6 weeks, and I finally hit page 550. And I know more about Frederick Douglass's refrigerator than I ever cared to know. I'm reading this, I'm like, can we just get to it? But some of you guys, you were great students. Me, I struggled in school. I actually told my kids, my 8th grade year, I got a 17.4% in algebra. Not 70.4, 17.4. Okay? So if you say, man, I get bad grades, I go, I hear you. I'm with you. My grades were terrible. We had to bring our report cards home to our parents. Mine never made it home. I was always like, I can take care of this. Yeah, there you go. My mom signed it. Yeah, sure, she saw it. Yeah, she took care of it. Nope. So I was like, yeah, Mom, what'd you get in algebra? I got a 70. Yeah, 70, not a 17, a 70. Yeah. So I was a terrible student. I never learned that the margins aren't rules to hem us in. The margins actually free us up to have space to do what God wants us to do. The margins actually create room for us to be flexible and listen for God. Listen, creating margin isn't about making rules to keep you from things. It's about freeing up room so that God can use you to do things. There's a difference. And when we make this mind shift, when we make this vision shift, then things start to clear up for us. When we don't create the necessary margin, there are consequences, right? And we all know this. We all know that when we live our lives to the fringes, we know that there's consequences. And many times the consequences come in small ways that add up to big ways if we don't address them. So what happens? I want to take a couple minutes. What happens when our margin decreases? Well, the first one is this. If you're writing things down, you can jot this down. The first thing that happens when our margin decreases is our stress increases. When your margin decreases, your stress increases. When you're living life to the edge or living life to the fringe, I'm not talking about living life to the fullest. I'm not talking about enjoying life. I'm talking about when you live to the very edge of the page and something happens, your stress level goes through the roof, right? Am I right? Have you ever left? Let me illustrate it this way because maybe you'll understand if I put it this way. We've seen it in other people's lives because nobody in this room would ever do this. But have you ever left late for work? And isn't it that when you leave late for work, every stoplight between your house and work turns red as you approach it? Right? And so as you approach the stoplight and it turns red, you now know you're going to sit there for the entirety of the stoplight, right? It can't turn yellow, so everybody knows that yellow doesn't mean caution, right? Yellow means hit the gas and get through before it turns red. You know that, right? Okay, so I didn't, if you just started driving, it means caution. Okay, so Nathan, it means slow down, okay? When I'm driving, it means gun it and get through before it turns red. But you see, when you leave for work late, what happens is that light turns yellow and then you watch it turn red and you want to gun it and go. But there's always that guy in front of you that the minute it turns yellow, he starts slowing down. And you're like, ugh. But what happens? You didn't leave enough time to leave to get to work on time. And what's happening? Now your stress level is rising because you didn't leave the margin you needed to get to work on time, right? And I'm not talking about things that happen outside of your control, like a car accident, right? You know, you leave enough time, but then you end up in traffic because somebody else didn't leave enough time. You know what I'm saying? And so, but what happens is when we live to the edges of the page, our stress level goes up because we don't have the space we need to handle the unexpected things, to handle the things. Listen, there's, again, one thing I've learned about my life is the unexpected is bound to happen. You've heard it, expect the unexpected. It's going to happen. Life is going to throw you a curveball. Maybe you're sitting in this room and you took those vows and you said yes to that person, expecting it to last the rest of your life, and now here you are. You didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't expect the curveball. You didn't expect it to come out of left field, but it did. Because life throws us the unexpected. But if we're living at the fringes and living at the edges, when the unexpected happens, our stress level goes up because we don't have the margin to handle it. So when someone is stretched to the edge of their time, they're rushed and they're hurried. They don't have time to sit still for a few moments. They don't have time to spend with their friends or with their loved ones. They say they don't have time to pray or read their Bible or spend time with God or serve at church. And the truth is this, it's not that they don't have the time, but they haven't created the margin to be able to spend their time in a wise way. Because we all have the same amount of time. We all have the same amount of opportunity with our time. So when someone is stretched to the edge of their money, their financial stress increases, right? When you watch the bank balance do this and the bill balance is doing this, stress increases when there isn't any margin. And so we wonder how we're going to pay our bills or how big or small our paycheck might be this week. We worry about getting sick and missing work because we won't have the resources that we need. We forget, and we think of all that. So forget about being generous. Forget about giving to others. Forget about supporting the work of God or other charities or being generous toward anybody because we don't even have the margin to pay our own bills. How can we trust God with any of it? And we don't have the resources to go around because we're living in the stress zone of no margins. And when we live close to the edges, when we live without margin in our lives, we find it a lot more stressful. We all know that that's the truth because we've all been there. We've all lived in it. Maybe you're living in it right now. Maybe you're just coming out of it. For some of you, you're just getting ready to go into it because life throws us the unexpected. Do you know what else happens when our margin decreases? When your margin decreases, and you can write this down if you want, when your margin decreases, your relational intimacy decreases. When your margin decreases, the time for people, the time for others, the time for building the relationships that will sustain you in your life decreases. Margin decreases and our stress goes up. When margin decreases, our relational intimacy goes down. the quality of our relationships dips off. When we're hurried, when there isn't any room or space in our lives, then we don't have the capacity we need to invest in the relationships that matter the most. We don't have it because we're living at the edges. But it isn't just about investing in others. It's also about others investing in us. Do you know the best way to have relationship is two-way? It goes both ways. The best friends you'll ever have in your life are the ones that come to you when they need something, but not only that, you know you can go to them when you need something. It's a two-way street. It's an investment in a relationship. And when we don't have the margin in our lives, our relationships become shallow or they become one-sided and we don't have any depth to them. It just becomes a text or a phone call. Hey, how you doing? Hey, have you ever said this? Hey, we should get lunch sometime. And then 6 more months goes by. Oh, where did the time go? We wasted it. Because we live at the margins and we don't have the time to invest in the relationships. And listen, maybe you're sitting here going, man, Pastor, stop. Please stop stepping on my toes. Can I tell you something? I'm stepping on my toes too because I don't have this all figured out. I was writing these sermon notes going, oh man, I'm screwed up. Like, I got a lot of work to do. Like, I really need to fix some things in my life. So God's speaking to all of us. And listen, there's nothing wrong with text messages. They're great. It's great to get a text message when someone thinks about you, isn't it? It's nice to look down and see that. But there's something greater when you have the intentional investment in relationship. The truth is, those things carry weight. Text messages, Facebook messages, whatever social media channels you use. The truth is, those things matter not because somebody reached out through Facebook, but because of the relationship that exists outside of that. That's why it matters when that person texts, because you have the relationship outside that brings context to it. And when we lack the margin in our lives, we don't have what we need to build those kinds of relationships. Maybe it's a friendship. Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe this morning you're sitting here going, man, we're just so busy that we don't have time to invest in our marriage. Can I tell you something? The cost of a divorce is a lot greater than the cost of investing in your marriage. I had a friend say to me one time, this was probably about 15 years ago, he said, I can't afford to go to that marriage conference. I said, you can't afford not to. That $300 for that marriage conference is a lot cheaper than the $600 the attorney is going to take when you file the divorce papers. Listen, relationships don't happen by accident. The best relationships are built intentionally. You have to invest the time. And if you don't have the margin, then you don't have the time to invest in the relationship. Maybe you're sitting here this morning going, man, I can't believe, will you stop? Please stop. You're making me feel miserable. But here's the good news. We've got hope today. We've got hope because there's good news here. When we lack the margin in our lives, when we don't have what we need to build those kinds of relationships, and that lack of relational intimacy, it begins to create a sense of loneliness and a lack of belonging, which leads us to go to dangerous places. And so the question becomes, what can I do about it? So maybe you're sitting here and you say, man, Pastor, I hear what you're saying. I get it. I know I need to address these things. But what can I do? How can I increase my relational intimacy? How can I decrease my stress level and create the margins necessary in my life? Maybe you're sitting here saying, is it even possible? Now listen, if you have little kids, it's a lot harder. See, my kids are a little older now, and let me tell you this. If you have small children, it gets better. It gets better. I want to tell you that it gets better. You feel like right now that there's just no time to even breathe, right? I saw a funny thing. I can't remember who posted it, but I saw this funny thing. It was a lady's knees sticking up out of the water in the bathtub, and she had the shower door slid shut, but the dog had pushed it open and stuck his face in like this. And the caption said, oh, here you are. If you don't come out and deal with one of these kids, I'm about to bite them. Listen, if you have little kids, you've been there. You've had those moments where, like, you just want to steal 5 seconds. Like, can't I just get away? Can't the pressures of life just take a break for 5 seconds? No, they can't. Unfortunately, they don't. It never stops. The pressures just change. But I can tell you this, when you lean into Christ, He shoulders the burden. The burden's never going to go away. Look, see, I thought as my kids got older, it would get easier. Time-wise, sometimes it does, but then you worry more. Because now you have less. See, when they're this big, you can tell them where to go. When they're this big, they tell you where they're going. And you're like, hold on a second. And then you realize, oh, wait, that time's passed. Like, you don't get to dictate it anymore. Now you just hope you did a good job. And then you hold on, right? And so as you grow and as you move through those phases of life, the pressures are always going to be there. And so the question is, how do we handle them? And the answer is absolutely yes. It is possible to create margin to make a difference. And so the answer is found in the New Testament biography about the life of Jesus. We call it the book of Matthew. But the book of Matthew, written by one of Jesus' 12 followers, Jesus says this in Matthew 11, verses 28 and 29. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me. Here it is. See, you want to know if it's possible? Here's the answer. Take up the yoke of Christ and learn from him. And this is what he says, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Listen, this is a huge claim that Jesus is making here. This is massive, and I want you to understand why. Because he's actually saying much more than just, if you're tired, come to me and I'll help you get some rest. He's saying much, much more than that. See, there was some ancient Jewish literature, and it had a theme of wisdom, and they actually called it wisdom with a capital W. They named this grouping of literature wisdom. And in this group of literature called wisdom that the ancient Jews had at their disposal was a saying very similar to this, that in wisdom you will find rest. When you understand and know and have the knowledge and the ability to make the decisions you need to make. Isn't that what wisdom is? Knowing the difference between right and wrong and then doing it. So what the wisdom literature said was, when you have wisdom, then you will have rest. And what Jesus does, and the Jews would have immediately picked up on this, Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. What he's saying is, if you want wisdom, it's right here. He's not saying, come to me and I'll give you wisdom. What he says is, I am the wisdom you need. The answer is found in Christ. We lean in to him and we trust him. The idea behind this literature was if you had enough wisdom and you had enough knowledge, then life would go well for you and you would be blessed. And what Jesus is doing is he's agreeing with that. He's saying, yes, that's true. If you have enough wisdom and you have enough knowledge, then life will go well for you. He's not arguing with the idea, but what he's pointing at is he's saying that where we find wisdom is in him. That he is the wisdom we seek and we need. He says, come to me if you are weary and burdened. So let's do this as we close. Let's have a come to Jesus moment. Let's take a moment and walk into the presence of Jesus. Let's go to him. The worship team's going to come, and they're going to lead us in just a few moments. But before we do anything else, you're asking the question, what can I do? How can I begin to change this? The truth is, many of us are living our lives in the margin, and we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, we're pressing too hard in our lives. And even if we wanted to do things differently, we don't feel like we could even find the time. Even if we wanted to hear God speak to us, we don't feel like we have the space to allow him to. And we can't serve God in our lives and in our church because we haven't found the margins that we need. We have filled the margins of life to overflowing. And we've stretched ourselves all the way to the edge of the page. So how do we begin to change it? The very first thing we need to learn is not what to do, but who to trust. And this is the final thing. If you're jotting stuff down, you can write this down. Creating margin will help us trust God and create rest in our lives. Did you know that God can do more with our little bit of time than we can? Did you know that God can do more with our money than we can? Did you know that God can do more with our relationships than we ever dreamed possible? And did you know this? Did you know that God has more at stake in this than you do? Did you realize that God didn't create you to live in the margins, to live outside the margins, but he created you to live inside the margins and to allow space for him to work and speak and move in our lives? Look at what he says in Isaiah chapter 58, verse 11. He says this, "The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden and like a spring whose water never runs dry." Man, what a place to live life. Right in the midst and presence of Jesus, where he waters our soul and he gives us rest and he teaches us how to create margin using the wisdom that he brings. So the question today is, what do I do right now? What do I do today? This is our come to Jesus moment. Let him be wisdom in your life. Let him begin to show you where to start and allow him to start to speak into those margins. And when you do that, what we just read in Isaiah becomes true of our lives. So before the worship team leads us, you have that bulletin, you have that sheet of paper. I told you we would come back to that this morning. I want you to pull that sheet of paper out. And in the seat back in front of you, there should be a pen. Somewhere in there, there's a pen. I want you to take that. Maybe you're sitting here and you're going, this is silly. I'm going to go warm the car up. That's okay, because that's exactly what I would probably do, okay? But just stick with me, okay? Stick with me on this. Take out that piece of paper, take that pen. Even those of you that think it's silly, do it anyway. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to take that piece of paper, and in between the margins, I want you to write the word trust. Because what we're going to do is we're going to begin to trust God with our time and allow him the space in the margins. We need to learn to trust him. We need to learn to trust that he knows what's best. Learn to trust that if we will leave the space for him to speak, he will speak. Learn to trust that if we leave the space in our resources, he will be our provider. And if that sheet of paper we hold in our hands represents the blank slate of our lives in the hands of God, then we must learn to trust him. And so what we're doing is we're taking our will and we're taking our life and we're writing trust on that blank piece of paper, because we're going to trust in God, knowing that he knows what is best. We're going to be wise and not foolish. We're going to make the most of the time we have, trusting him and letting him show us that he is good. Show us his perfect and pleasing will. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take the next couple of moments. And maybe you're here and you need to trust him. And maybe the step you need to take today is just coming to the altar and just laying that piece of paper on the steps and just worshiping him. Maybe what you need to do is take a few moments right there at your seat. Maybe you're not comfortable being up here. Can I tell you this, though? Being up front at the altar isn't a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of understanding where God is moving and wants to touch your heart. So maybe you just need to find a place somewhere up here with him and just get on your knees and just talk to God and lay that in front of him and say, God, I know I'm going to fail. I know I'm going to be imperfect, but I'm going to trust you. If we would just take the next few moments and do that this morning, I could promise you this. God does not leave or forsake. God never fails. You can trust him. You can trust him with your entire life because he wants to move and speak. Would you stand with me as we get ready to worship? I'm going to pray, and then the worship team is going to lead us in a song or two, and we're going to open these altars for a time of prayer. We're here to pray with you, and we invite you to come and find a place here with Jesus. But let's pray. Father, we thank you for what you're doing. God, my prayer this morning is that each and every one of us would begin to trust. We would begin to find you, begin to seek you. God, that we would begin to take our lives, the blank slate that they are, and lay them at your feet and say, Jesus, teach us. God, help us to trust. Help us to find you. Help us to love you and to worship you. And help us to create the margin in our lives where you can speak to us. God, we love you this morning. It's not about rules, do's, and don'ts. It's about creating the space to allow God to have his way. And we thank you for it. Let's just take the next few moments and worship together. Find a place here at the altar. We're here to pray with you if you want prayer. And so we invite you to come. Come and worship. Come and pray. And let's seek him together.